Hello everyone, my name is Brooklyn Richards and today I'm going to be sharing with you pollinators and fire. So despite how extensively understood fires are, the impact that fires have on pollinators and their interactions with plants is pretty poorly understood. But because pollinators are such an important keystone ecological group, there's been an increasing effort in recent years to better understand this impact. This is also because as climate change continues, fires are going to become more and more prevalent. So just thinking about why pollinators are important to ecosystems as a whole, they're an essential part of plant reproduction. And this role they play in plant reproduction makes them an essential part of supporting the entire food chain. So if there aren't enough plants for the primary consumers to eat, there aren't going to be enough primary consumers for the secondary consumers to eat, and this food shortage is really going to work its way up the entire food chain. Um, the relationship between plants and pollinators dates back 100 million years, and this competition has ultimately been the driving force of angiosperm dominance and diversification. So pollinators have been the reason behind the flower shapes, smells, colors, and sizes that we see. While many pollinators are generalists, like the honeybee is a pretty good example of a pollinator that's pretty successful in most of what it tries to pollinate. Many of them have developed very specialized relationships with plants. And the most extreme example of that is obligate pollination. So, an example of obligate pollination that's pretty local is yucca moths and yucca plants. Basically, if either population is harmed, there's this co-extinction because they are so dependent on one another. And that makes these specialized pollinators especially vulnerable to climate change, just due to the loss of biodiversity caused by anthropogenic-driven climate change and habitat loss. So, looking at how fires impact plants, fires are actually a good thing. They play an important role in ecosystem management. They kill off competing species, and the plants that do die in fires, their nutrients gets returned to the soil, and therefore they recharge the entire system. The conditions, though, for fires to be beneficial for ecosystems is that there needs to be a moderate frequency and low intensity. So moderate frequency meaning they're not happening too often or too far apart so that there's this huge buildup of fuel. And then low intensity just means that they're not burning too hot. The issue here, though, is that climate change has created a hotter and drier world, and it's increased temperatures, increased drought, and prolonged the fire season. So basically, all of these work together to create this huge buildup of fuel. So when we do see fires, they're going to be these extreme, catastrophic fires. And we've seen that sort of increased fire activity over the past 40 years or so. And these more extreme fire events are going to make less resilient ecosystems. So they're not able to bounce back as easily as a fire that is just more low intensity. And then continuing on for how fires impact plants, we see this immediate post-fire response of a massive bloom of wildflowers. And that happens because wildflower seeds can remain dormant in soil for decades, and they're only going to bloom when the conditions are perfect. And fires do a really good job of creating these perfect wildflower conditions. So they eliminate competition, and they also, the heat from the fire breaks down the seed barrier. So after a wildfire, you have this huge bloom. And as you can imagine, that kind of concentration of really densely packed nectar and pollen is actually going to promote pollinator abundance and diversity. So, with that being said, the overall effect of fires is actually positive for pollinators, but there's going to be some important caveats. The positive effect that I mentioned doesn't benefit all groups equally. The most benefited group is Hymenoptera. And then if these fires are burning too frequently or too intensely, the ecosystem just can't recover. And then in that case, it's actually going to have a negative impact on pollinators. So just taking a closer look at other factors that might be contributing to pollinator decline. So the massive wildflower bloom that I was mentioning is mainly going to be beneficial for daytime pollinators like bees. A study in Portugal looking at moths in a recently burned area found that the moths in these areas were carrying 5 times less the amount of pollen that moths in unburned areas were. And in addition to that, the moths had a lower species richness in these areas. And then moths are a part of the order Lepidoptera. So Lepidoptera as a whole, their larva is going to be much more vulnerable to fires than Hymenoptera larvae. And thinking about why that might be, it's because a lot of bee species, besides bumblebees and honeybees, are solitary bees which nest below ground or in woody cavities. And this position of their larvae really protects them from things like fire because being underground offers a lot of protection. And when you think about where Lepidoptera larvae might be, caterpillars are generally just out in the open eating plants. So they are much less protected when a fire rolls through than Hymenoptera larvae would be. And a study trying to understand bee heat tolerance basically mimicked soil heat conduction for bees at different stages of their life. And this study found that all stages of life can tolerate up to 113 degrees for 27 minutes. And of all 4 life stages, pupa survives the best. But none of the stages can tolerate 129 degrees for 9 minutes. So what we can conclude from that then is that ground nesting bees are unlikely to die. But among these, there's still going to be more susceptible ground nesting species just because if they're nesting more shallow, they're going to be more vulnerable to fires. And an example of that would be species belonging to the genus Osmia. Those are some beautiful bees pictured below belonging to the genus Osmia, and they have these shallower nests in the ground, so they are more vulnerable. And we can also conclude that the prolonged superheat is more deadly than a brief superheating. So once you get up to these deadly temperatures, raising it to the 129 degrees and then dropping it leaves the bee with a pretty good chance of surviving. But it's the prolonged exposure to the very hot temperatures that are going to be more deadly. And this seems pretty intuitive, but what it means in terms of fires is that bees aren't going to be able to survive the longer lasting, hotter burning fires, the fires that stick around because of that prolonged deadly temperature. And then this is just a graph I included for the fire impact among different arthropod orders. I went ahead and circled in red the pollinating orders Coleoptera, Diptera, Hymenoptera, and Lepidoptera. And as you can see, among these 4 orders, Lepidoptera is the only one where the negative impact actually outweighs the positive and neutral impact combined. And then thinking about mobility and fire survival, the more mobile the insect is, the likely they are to survive the fire. And that's just due to likelihood of escaping. So that is across all arthropods. As you can imagine, eggs that are laid in a really vulnerable spot really have no way of escaping the fire, so they have a really high likelihood of dying from the fire, whereas adults that can just fly away have a much higher chance of surviving. In addition to that, if you are a pretty poor flyer, your likelihood of escaping goes down. Of course, there are other ways to escape a fire. Many flightless coleopteran species they're actually fast enough to be able to outrun the fire. Others can take refuge under rocks, but flight is a characteristic that is generally shared across pollinators, so I just thought that that was an important thing to include. And then thinking about the other factors that are at play, most of these studies don't distinguish whether the species that are foraging in these massive wildflower blooms live here or if they're just visiting. And the difference is going to matter because that's the difference between whether you can conclude that the fire is causing this full recolonization or if it's just attracting visitors. Another thing that's going to contribute to the population growth we see in pollinators after fires is that fires eliminate predators and parasites that otherwise keep population levels down. So it isn't just the massive wildflower bloom that's creating this growth in population. It's also the elimination of other limiting factors. And then some ecosystems are much better studied than others, which means that patterns you observe in one community should not be generalized to hold true across all communities. In particular, the savanna and tropical rainforests have pretty limited research on the impact fire has on pollinators. And then communities like grasslands, the plants are really well adapted to recovering quickly from fires. So resilience that you might observe in grasslands, for example, shouldn't be generalized across the board. And then lastly, most of these studies happened in pretty immediate post-fire communities, meaning 6 months or less. So more research definitely needs to be done to understand the longer-term impacts that fires have on pollinators. So in conclusion, fires are going to have an overall positive impact on pollinators, but there is variation in these benefits among different orders, species, and life stages. So fires that burn too intensely or too frequently are going to have a negative impact on pollinators because the ecosystem just isn't going to be able to recover from these extremes in time. And that is all I have. Thank you so much for listening.